Julia Feathermore enters the cold room under escort, its plain white walls stark against the dim lighting. The fluorescent light flickers sporadically, then stops, only to resume at random moments. A small bed sits in the corner, its white sheets neatly tucked under the thin mattress, with a scratchy wool blanket stretched across it. Can this really be called a mattress? It's too thin, more like a foam pad. She was supposed to be here for only 30 days, but it's been 6 months, from what she can tell. But she has to admit her perception of time is as skewed as her perception of reality at this point. If you're into twisted stories of the strange or paranormal, subscribe to the channel and help me grow it. Each and every one of you are appreciated so much more than I know how to say. And stick around for the full story. You won't want to miss the twists throughout and the big twist at the end. Now, let's get back to Julia. Julia's parents had her placed in this mental institution. They haven't visited her, nor does Julia know if they've even checked on her progress. The doctors say no. It's very odd behavior for them. They love her. That's why they urged her to get help to begin with. Help. Dr. Matthews told her it's for the best with her rare condition of Todd Syndrome, or Alice in Wonderland Syndrome as it has become known, explaining that her distortion of reality would only be exacerbated if her familiar environment wasn't taken away. He assured Julia that she was on the mend, but her treatments must intensify. But in her mind, things are getting worse, much worse. Reality, fantasy, hallucinations, or even a growing sense she has entered into some twisted version of reality plague her thoughts constantly. Help. Help. Julia sits on the edge of her bed, staring at the blank walls. The room's emptiness feels suffocating. The silence heavy inside. Outside, she can hear the muffled cries of other patients. She tries to run her hand through her matted hair, which used to have a shimmer to its blonde iridescence, but is now a dirty, dull color 3 shades darker. As usual, her fingers only comb a small section of the thick clumps. She recalls her first conversation with Dr. Matthews, back when she would have never let herself look this way. But sometimes her memories are distorted by the medications she's forced to take. Whatever these meds are. Whenever she asks, she's told simply that they are to help her. This feels less like help. 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 The word replays in her mind but never leaves her lips anymore. Even when she's alone, she knows she's being watched and listened to. And the last time she cried for help, she felt a sharp, slow pain in her neck, then came to her senses a day later with no memory as to what had happened after the jab. Dr. Matthews tells her in a monotone voice, "Your parents thought it best for you to stay here until your condition improves. We're here to help you, Julia. Help. Help." That's what she was seeking when she agreed to this treatment. Help. Somehow the word has taken on a new meaning. It is twisted into something awful. She hears a light tapping on her window and looks over as she hears rain lightly pattering on her barred windows. Her mind drifts, sways with the light wind breezing past as it glides the streaks of rain to the side of the glass pane, pulling along the bottom edge. She swears she can see her reflection in each of those tiny drops. Only she's distorted. Her thoughts wander to the feeling of the wind and water droplets on her face and shoulders. Oh, how she used to love walking in the rain. Then she felt something tap her face. She reached up to wipe it. A drop of water. She looked up, but there was nothing coming through the ceiling. Then another hit her robe on her shoulder. Julia can always tell when the medications start to wear off. Her universe starts to bend and she's able to think, remember. Her past life seems more real than the help she is receiving here. But as quickly as the effects of the evil drugs leave her system, an orderly arrives with more, fogging her brain, somehow making her less of a human, and she loses more of her true self a little more with each swallow of the chalky pills, which somehow leave a metallic taste in her mouth. Bitter, stinging, like biting down on a foil wrap with a tooth that has a filling. Her mouth becomes dry, and oftentimes the orderlies won't let her have more than a Dixie cup of water, left in her room to suffer. She thinks they get enjoyment out of it, but all she wants is to get better so she can leave this place, so she doesn't cause trouble anymore. Julia's reality has become a series of regimented routines, punctuated by the occasional disturbance, removing any semblance of independence and replacing it with structure. At least that's the word these awful people use, structure. Julia has never posed a threat to herself or anyone else. She's a kind soul with empathy and compassion. She has witnessed patients who are less like her, patients who have darker tendencies. The ones who have to be strapped to their beds at night. The ones who get a quick shot to the neck when they show any sign of resistance. The patients who need that shot to sleep at night, or they will be moaning and screaming throughout the night. One boy used to sit with her in the common area. He was always nice to her. He didn't speak much. Well, she spoke, but he only replied with gestures, and she never really knew his name. But she figured he was around 16 years old, the same age as her. She just knew the way his eyes gazed upon her was one of adoration. Nothing to be concerned about. He didn't stare at her. He would answer questions by shaking or nodding his head, but he always had a sad undertone to his demeanor. He always kept himself at a safe distance so as not to frighten her. Or maybe he was just shy, just like Julia herself. One day he was sitting across from Julia, and an orderly walked behind him and whispered something Julia couldn't quite make out into the boy's ear. The boy stood up and attacked the orderly abruptly and seemingly out of character for the boy. As he did so, he tried to yell, and Julia noticed his tongue was missing. This explains why he never spoke. Her heart nearly leapt out of her chest in solemn pity for the boy. As the orderly restrained him, Julia could see the orderly smiling malevolently. The orderly, she thinks his name is Sam, ended up laying on his back, with the boy laying on his back and on Sam's chest, with Sam's arms and legs wrapped around him, restraining him as another orderly slowly stuck a needle into the boy's neck. It seemed the needle was injected much slower than it should have been, as if the deliverer was enjoying it. Sam continued his smile as the boy went limp, then released his yielding victim. They didn't carry the boy out of the common area. No, they dragged him by his wrists, dragged him out of the room and down the hall to the locked double doors. Julia didn't dare stand to watch them exit, but she could hear his body sliding lifelessly on the linoleum tile until the doors closed. Suddenly, the muttered chatter fell silent in the room, and everyone was escorted back to their cells. Rooms. Julia sat on the edge of her bed again. In her room, that's the only real choice she had. She could beat her fists on the door or walls, but that would just keep her in this institution longer, which seemed crazier than any of its patients. Longer. Maybe forever. Being compliant was her only tool to ensure that didn't happen. So she sat there, daydreaming until the meds kicked in again and left her sitting with a blank mind. Her eyes relaxed and her eyelids covered half her pupils as they dilated. Her mind adrift on a vast sea of calm, with the exception of images. The horrible images. Scenes depicting her on her back, people in medical coats all around her, hooking machines into her nostrils and down her throat, long wires that seemed to move on their own. The lab coat people just stared at her. She told Dr. Matthews about these visions, the side effects of the drugs, and he increased her meds. He said it was her own psychosis bleeding through. She didn't dare tell him anything else about it, ever again. She would just nod and say there were no more visions. He would stare her down with an eyebrow raised high into his receding hairline, gauging her for a lie. It had been weeks since Julia had seen the boy, and she had almost forgotten about him when he showed up in the common area. Forgetting things, an effect of the chalky metallic tasting drugs. She noted the blank expression on his face, his eyes, once full of adoration for her, now hold an unsettling calmness. She smiled at him and gave him a small wave, keeping her hand close to her face and just bending her fingers in unison, and mouthed the word, "Hi." It was more like she exhaled it. He didn't even acknowledge Julia as he passed her by. He always sat at the table in the past, directly across from her. Now it was like Julia didn't exist. But there was something else strange about him. He had lost the innocent look he had once carried. Even though he was in this disgusting place, he had always had a look of wonder and curiosity about him. His hair was always short, messy, but short. Now his head was shaved. Did he do this on his own? Likely not. It made him look like an adult. In fact, his entire demeanor made it seem he had aged 20 years in just a couple of weeks. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. There was something dark about him, just beneath the surface now. Julia shivered under her skin with an uneasy feeling, and goosebumps raised the hairs on her arms. She reverted her eyes from him as she noticed he seemed to be looking through her, not at her. Julia shook the feeling and went back to her solo game of Connect 4 alone. She used to try to put puzzles together, but the less settled patients would test her kindness by pushing the puzzle into the floor, then scattering the pieces with their feet, just before they too were given the slow shot and dragged away. Connect 4 was the least damning option for her and the other patients. But there was a change in the boy which she had grown fond of, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she should be afraid of him. There weren't many in the common area that she would fear in the past, but now the number had been growing. Help. Help. One night Julia hears whispers outside her door, more like muffled screams and shuffling. She woke up in a drug-induced haze, but was slowly gaining her thought processes back as the pills started to lose their effect. Eyes still a bit dilated and blurry, Julia had to squint to peek through the small window in her cell door. Her room door. It isn't an uncommon sight, but she stares anyway, with her eyes barely visible above the rim of the window, so she isn't seen by prying eyes. She sees two orderlies leading a patient, dragging him, kicking and protesting down the hall. The patient's eyes are wide with terror, but his screams are muffled by the institution's thick walls and metal doors. He makes eye contact with Julia as he passes her door, then latched both hands onto her door frame as his face came close to her window. Help! She couldn't hear the word clearly, but she knew what he said as she ducked down below the window. Julia probably would have been more terrified had she been fully conscious. But these damn drugs. Help. Help. A sentiment she knew all too well inside her own screaming mind. As she got up from the floor, her elbow tapped the metal door. That was usually enough to alarm the orderlies that someone was out of bed. But they seemed preoccupied and paid her no attention. She took a deep breath, then scooted back to her bed and lay with her eyes wide open. Then she heard something. Tick, tick, tick. A sound she had never heard in her usually quiet room. Julia traced the sound and tracked it to just above the door. She looked up at the wall above the door and saw something she had never noticed before. Tick, tick, Tick. An old clock mounted to the wall with a wire cage around it. Tick, tick, tick. The instant silence that came with the patient being dragged through the door highlighted the sound of the second hand slowly counting down to the next minute. But this had not been there before. Julia would have noticed the clock. It had to have been placed there as she slept. But why? The minute hand didn't move when the second hand rounded the 60-second mark. Tick, tick, tick. Not forward. It moved backward. Why was it here? She tried to close her eyes and go back to sleep as she pulled the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. But it was different too. When she had fallen asleep, the blanket was long enough to cover her feet when she pulled it to her chin. Now, it came up to her shins. She turned the blanket to see if she got it twisted somehow, but it was even worse that way. What the hell is going on? Help. Help. She wonders if she really is as crazy as they say she is. But she knows the clock was not there and her blanket was longer. Even being as scratchy as it is, it was still more comfortable than nothing. The following morning, the patient was gone. Julia asked the nurse, checking her vitals for weekly checkup, but the response is always the same. He's gone for treatment. He'll be back soon. Don't worry. It seems your blood pressure is up, Julia. Are you feeling stressed? That is one of the most monotone voices she has ever heard. Julia has her back to the clock. Tick, tick, tick. But she saw the nurse glance up at it with a slight smile pulling the corners of her mouth. Her mouth. There was a large mole with hair coming out of it on the corner of her mouth. Generally, Julia doesn't judge people on things they have no control over. But given the situation she's in, what else should Julia focus on? The mole that seems to breathe? The incessant ticking of the clock, which is louder than any clock she has heard before? Or just bite her lip and focus on getting the nurse out of there? The nurse stood and took the 2 Dixie cups from her cart and handed them to Julia. She's annoyed at this point. She saw Julia staring at the mole. She's leaning in Julia's face so close Julia can almost taste her breath. Take your fucking pills. This time she isn't monotone. She keeps her face close to Julia's until Julia swallows. The nurse grabs Julia's chin with one hand and pulls her mouth open as she sweeps the inside of Julia's mouth with the other, checking to make sure the pills are gone. Good fucking girl. Then she pushes her cart into the hallway, slamming Julia's room door behind her. Julia bursts into tears. Help. Help. The words ease past her dried lips this time, louder than she intends to ever speak those words. That afternoon, the orderlies approached Julia in the cafeteria. Sam and what's his name? She forgets. Some of the patients try to get on good terms with the orderlies, mostly newer patients, but it never turned out well. They're not the sort of staff that are there for small talk or getting to know the patients. Honestly, they don't care who you are or what you've done. Compliance. It's the only thing they respond to. Sam is a towering man around 6 feet 6 inches, tall and broad-shouldered with a neck tattoo of a butterfly. Julia can't believe her friend even tried to take him on. The other guy, what's his name, is shorter but no less imposing, a little more handsome. One alone is enough to make Julia sweat just by standing near her, and now she has both of them. Dr. Matthews wants to see you in his office. Come with us, ordered Sam in a deep, threatening voice. This makes Julia nervous. It's never good when the doctor wants to see her outside of her regularly scheduled visits. Sam pounded on the office door. Not that he could help it. His fists are the size of grapefruits. She could hear Dr. Matthews' faint voice from behind the door telling them to enter. The little guy opened the door and Sam pushed Julia forward into the office. It wasn't a nudge. Julia almost lost her balance. Dr. Matthews stood from behind his desk. He stood so fast his comb-over flapped a little. "Is that any way to treat our guest, Sam?" he asked in a way that seemed like it absolutely was okay to treat her that way. Sam didn't respond. The two men just backed out into the hall and closed the door behind them. She swears the doctor smiled when he said it, but it's best not to point out anything like that. "Have a seat, Julia." Julia takes the seat in front of his desk. This man gives her the creeps. It's like he's looking through her clothes at her. Julia crosses her arms over her chest. "Yes, Julia, I'm increasing your prescription. You've been showing signs of rebellion lately, and that's a sign that your condition has gotten worse." Usually Julia is the first to keep her mouth shut. It's best not to rock the boat, but her mouth opened before she could stop it. "What? Why? I've been nothing but obedient." The doctor's eyebrow raised, and Julia thought it would get tangled in his comb-over if it were going any higher. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," said Dr. Matthews with a harsh tone. Julia sank into her seat, lost in her head. All she could think was, help, help. But she knows there is no one to give any help. Her own family had not even checked on her. This gave her a little courage. "Am I free to go now?" The good doctor stood. "Sam!" It was no sooner that Matthews called his name, the door flung open, and Sam and the other guy, what's-his-name, stepped in and grabbed her, ushering her into the hall. Outside the office, Nurse Mole waited with 2 Dixie cups. She grabbed Julia by the cheeks and forced her mouth open as Sam and little man held onto her. "Open wide, bitch!" Nurse Mole, for a lack of Julia knowing her actual name, said as she dumped the contents into Julia's mouth. She then held Julia's mouth closed and pinched her nose shut. "Help! Help!" Julia swallowed hard, and the nurse released her as Julia grasped to fill her lungs with oxygen. The smell of mold and sweat filled her senses. This place reeks of it all the time. It was hard to get used to at first, but Julia managed. It was occasions such as this that the horrible smell would return to remind her of what a bad place this is. The nurse turned away, and Sam and the little man, still gripping hard onto Julia's biceps, escorted her to her room. Sam looked in for a split second, "Nighty-night," and turned out the light and slammed the door closed. The room was dead silent, except tick, tick, tick. When the sound was new, it was mildly irritating, but now it's becoming the sound of madness, like tiny drops of water pinging inside a metal bucket slowly. Julia felt more of herself slip away. She lay awake at night just hearing the tick, tick, tick. Help, help, being more than careful to make sure the word didn't slip out of her mouth this time. As the increased prescription began to course through her veins, penetrating her heart and slowing it to a tiny thump in her chest, then showering her brain in its chalky hate. Her eyes widened. Her pupils expanded almost beyond her irises. She slammed her eyes shut, trying to convince herself that this would pass, that this was almost over. Her eyes snapped open as if to have a will of their own. The shadows in her room became deeper and darker. She slowly regained control of her eyelids for a moment and closed them. The same. They sprung back open. The room was somehow lighter. One more attempt left her eyes closed for a bit longer. She sunk into her bed deeper and relaxed. Then suddenly, her eyes shot open again. Julia wasn't in her room anymore. She was surrounded by a thick, lush forest. There was more green than she knew was possible. It was hard for her to move, so she lay there peering around, with her eyes being the only mobile part of her body. The ticking was gone, replaced by a humming sound, like the flapping of a hummingbird's wings, soft but disturbing. Beneath the humming, or buried deep within it, was a low-pitched reverberation that shook her inner ears. Had she been standing? She knew she would have lost her balance. Her head became light. Her mind felt as though it was both flooding and being drained at the same time. She tried to move her arms, but it was useless. She could feel them ache from the attempt. Not even one of her fingers would budge. She laid there, paralyzed, afraid. Help! Help! The air filled with the hummingbird and the reverberations. It became so intense she could feel her very muscles vibrating. It lasted for hours. As the world began to draw darker, it was more like looking through a tube. She could feel her heartbeat return to normal. Tick, tick, tick. That damn sound began to drown everything else out. She knows that the clock is new, a recent addition. But why? Why put something in her room to make her feel mad? Finally, her eyelids slowly started covering her wet eyes. As she awakes, she sees a team of lab coats standing over her, poking, prodding, shining lights in her eyes as they held her eyelids open. What starts as a low, incomprehensible muttering, her ears awaken, and the sounds take the shapeless voices of, "Do you think it worked? Looks like it. Take notes. I think we have a breakthrough." The voices were dull, like they were coming from someone not in the room, monotone. But she saw the mouths of those standing around her in sync with the words being spoken. Her eyes dart around the room. A machine with a needle is perched just above her face with a needle aimed at her eye. She tastes the metal again. It sends shocks of electricity into her teeth. Help! Help! One of the blurry figures places something over her mouth, and she loses consciousness. When Julia awakes, her room is normal. Well, normal for this place. The sticky white walls, the cold linoleum floor, the dingy mirror on the opposite wall, and tick, tick, tick. She grabs her aching head with both hands and squeezes. She hasn't heard her own voice very much lately. Only her thoughts remind her of what she even sounded like before all of this. But she realizes her voice doesn't sound the same in her head anymore. It's changed. One thing she would be complimented on was her soft voice. She could calm a room of fighting relatives with a single word. Now, it felt raspy, tired, angry. At least that's how it sounds in her head. She tries to run her fingers through her hair, forgetting it's a knotted mess of tangles and sweat. Her fingers hit a mat of hair so hard that when she pulls her fingers out, there's a clump of hair intertwined in her fingers. She jumps onto unsteady feet and tries desperately to regain her balance, wobbling as she extends her hands for leverage. When she feels her equilibrium return, she slowly shuffles her feet to carry her to the mirror, and she's terrified at what she sees. Julia has aged 20 years overnight. Her skin isn't smooth like it had been the day before, and there is gray in the roots of her hair. Where her fingers had ripped her hair out, there's a small bald spot at her temple where her hair had once been. She leans her forehead against the mirror and sobs, "Help! Help!" Tick, tick. Then the sound stops. Slowly she rolls her forehead off the mirror and looks up above the door. The clock's gone, but she notices the door isn't completely closed. She scoots her feet over to the door and slowly opens it just enough to peer into the hallway. It's different. All the lights are off, all but one, and it's flickering, casting a strobe into the empty hallway. The paint is peeling from the walls, and dirt and leaves litter the broken linoleum-tiled floor. Julia walks into the hallway. There's no one around to stop her. She walks down the hallway toward the common area. As she passes each cell, room, she notices most of the doors hang open. She looks into the room where the boy she sat with once bunked. The sunlight poured through his barred window, revealing a skeleton slumped in the bed. Julia's hand shoots up to cover her mouth as she gasps in horror. Still sluggish, she moves back toward her own room. The hall's still empty. Help! Help! This time she heard her raspy voice say the word. As she crosses the threshold into her room, her eyes shoot open, and she's laying in her bed again. Tick, tick, tick. Julia launches herself out of her bed and rushes to the mirror. Normal. She's 16 again. Her voice even sounds familiar in her head. Tears lunge from her eyes as she slides down the wall into a fetal position on the floor. Suddenly, she hears the sound of her door unlocking and it flings open. Sam. Let's go, princess. Time for breakfast. She stands and walks to the door, where Sam grips her bicep with force. You're lucky. If it were up to me, I'd let you starve. I'd let all of you starve. In a monotone voice, as he jerks her forward down the hall. Julia is accustomed to this treatment. It isn't preferable, but there's nothing she can do about it. Even her parents haven't tried to help her. Help. Help. Sam pulls her to a stop and leans down to her. No one can help you. She knows she didn't speak the word. She knows it. Then Sam dragged her by her arm to the lunchroom and pushed her into a chair. The room is filled with patients. The boy. And wait, the other boy she saw being dragged down the hall. He too was different. His eyes blank of any emotion, staring straight through her. Fear gripped Julia's heart and pushed the hairs on her neck up to attention. She looks around and her former friend is staring through her as well. As a tray of food is dropped in front of her, she sees that more people are just as the two boys. But there are two others, new. She'd never seen them before. They're sitting together at a table in the corner. They glance at her. She sees fear in their eyes. One of them jerks his head around to revert his eyes from her. The other drops his head to look straight down at his metal tray. Does she have the same blank yet intimidating look in her own eyes? Did the lab coats do to her whatever they had done to her friend and the other boy? Things have been weird lately. Her mind rushed back to her dreams. The lab coats, the empty unit, the skeleton. How much she aged in that dream. It was so vivid, not like a normal dream. She remembered every detail. It had to be the increased medication, but it seemed so real. She's here now, though. She isn't old. Her hair isn't falling out. The hospital is mostly alive. Alive. Such a strange word for this place. As unsettling as everything has been this day, Julia manages to finish what little she can eat of her meal. What even is this stuff she's eating? There's no taste, and the texture is more like clay with sand in it than any food she had ever had. She isn't a snob by any manner of the word. Her family didn't come from money. In fact, this was the only institution that would help her given their financial inadequacies. Help. Help. Suddenly, Sam grabs her arm and jerks her out of her seat so hard that her chair falls over and shoves into the wall with a metal crash. He drags her by the arm to her room so hard that she stumbles the entire way. He opens the door and shoves her in. She trips and hits the floor onto her knees. The door slams shut. Tick, tick, tick. Julia sobs with her face in her hands. She forgets she's always being watched. The camera in the upper corner of her room makes sure of that. Her door jolts open again, and in the opening stands Nurse Mole. Get up. It's time for your meds. Julia has barely been awake for an hour. How can it be time again? I don't like them. They make me feel... I didn't ask if you liked them, you crazy bitch. Sam rushes in with the commotion and jerks Julia up by her arms. He stands behind her, holding her arms behind her back, his knee in her spine, bending her backwards. Tick, tick, tick. Nurse Mole moves into position, squeezing Julia's tear-stained cheeks until her mouth drops open, with her own face close enough to Julia's that Julia could smell her nasty breath. Using her fingers, she shoves the pill to the back of Julia's throat and grabs her jaw, holding her mouth and nose closed. Julia cries as the pill falls into her throat, almost choking her. She takes 2 big gulps and the pill finally dislodges from her esophagus, plummeting down to her digestive system. The 2 assailants release Julia and exit the room, Sam closing the door slowly with a grin. Night, night. Tick, tick, tick. It doesn't take long before the effects of the chalky, even more metallic-tasting drug begins traveling through Julia's veins. When it reaches her heart, she feels her heart slow. She wonders just how slow her heart is beating, and if she should even be alive at this point. Uneasy on her feet, her knees buckle, and she falls to the floor like a rag doll, landing half on her side and half on her back. Her face is pointing under the bed when she loses control of all her movement, paralyzed. Her breath slows. She isn't even sure if she's breathing. She can't feel the air piercing her gaping mouth nor entering her lungs. But somehow, she's still conscious. The shadows under the bed darken and twist, contorting. Help. Help. Manipulated by something unseen until the underside of her bed resembles a cave with a light coming from the opening in the distance. Her eyes dart up and the cave grows, surrounding her, engulfing her, plunging her into blackness with a light coat of orange and red light sprinkled the misshapen edges of the jutting rocks from the cave. Julia's hand began to twitch. She felt it move. She tried moving it under her will, first her fingers, then her wrists. It was all moving. Stiff and aching but slightly mobile, slowly she started regaining control of her other muscles. She could feel the very tendons and ligaments stretching as she fought to increase her movement. Choking back tears, Julia rose to her feet like a mighty oak tree stretching for the sun's nourishment. Her legs were suddenly stable as she walked toward the orange-red glow at the mouth of the cave. Step by step, Julia increased her speed. She was just about to the cave's entrance when she felt 2 gentle hands guiding her along on her shoulders. She turned around to look, but no one was behind her. There was no one anywhere, yet the hands remained until she emerged from the cave into a beautiful pasture. Then, the hands released her as if to set her free. Freedom. She feels the warm setting sun on her skin, wrapping itself around her in a warm embrace. Julia didn't know where she was. She didn't care. She wasn't in that horrific hospital anymore. No Sam to be seen, no Nurse Mole, no Dr. Matthews. She was alone, and that suited her just fine. Julia tilted her head back and closed her eyes as the last of the sun's rays beamed down on her. Spreading her arms to soak in as much of it as possible, she allowed herself to spin around a couple of times, giving herself a moment of peace. She ventured a bit further into the pasture of green grass and tall wildflowers of every color imaginable. Her hands raked the top of the flowers as she walked forward, with no destination in mind, nor would she know of a destination. A tree in the distance seemed like a good place to relax, tall and majestic, a single redwood in the middle of this vast plain. As intoxicating as this felt, she noticed there was no sound. She spoke, but the sound barely left her lips. She yelled, and it seemed to be caught just in front of her. She could barely hear it with her own ears. She shook it off as a possible side effect of the chalky metallic pill forced into her throat earlier that day by Nurse Mole. Birds flew overhead. Wind rustled through the tree and the grass, but there was still no sound. But what did she need sound for? If she were alone, she wouldn't need to talk to anyone, nor listen to them. When she reached the tree, she sat atop its roots and leaned against the trunk, marveling at the world around her. Even as this place began getting darker, there was something beautiful about it. A halo of orange and red hovered on the horizon, the stars bright in the clear sky, as if someone had placed them there one by one, just for her. The day had exhausted her, and she allowed herself to curl up for a nap. Her hospital gown and oversized pants were enough to keep her warm, although it was a perfect temperature. As she lay at the base of the redwood, she told herself, this is where she wants to spend her last days. Her eyes shut. It wasn't an hour later when Julia's eyes opened to a dark field. The tree was gone, and the sky was black as coal. No stars could be seen. What she could see of her immediate surroundings was just as bleak. The flowers lay at the base of their stalks, broken, decayed, and she realized what had awakened her. The humming. The sound of the hummingbird wings mixed with a low-toned reverberation. She could feel the vibrations shaking her muscles. Every vein seemed to pulsate to the low sound. Her body began to contort and twist, churning under her skin. Her skin felt tight and loose at the same time, as if her molecules were being stretched over her bones. She cried out, but no sound emanated from her vocal cords. She gripped the ground with both hands as she felt herself being lifted, pulled up by her feet. She looked down and saw a dark figure pulling at her ankles, dragging her back to the tunnel. Her hands released the dead grass from her grasp involuntarily. She tried to move, but was once again paralyzed. The humming grew more intense, breaking up into the beats, a pattern. Whoomp, whoomp, wink, wink, tick, tick, tick. Her eyes stared at her feet as she saw the dark entity take shape. Sam! And she wasn't in the meadow anymore. She was being dragged down the hall of the hospital by her ankles, but the hospital was in disrepair. Paint peeling from the walls, the drop ceiling tiles teetering in their frames, one light flickering. She looked to the side and saw the skeleton of the boy slumped in his bed as she passed his room. With a quick jolt, Sam slid Julia into her room so hard she banged her head on the floor. Tick, tick, tick. She looked up as the door slammed shut and locked, but the clock was missing. Tick, tick, tick. Julia laid there for a moment, her control of her muscles and bones regaining movement slowly. When just enough strength returned, Julia pulled herself along the dirty floor to the wall and pressed her back to it, as her legs forced her upward. She wiped the dirt and grime from the mirror with her sleeve and peered in. She was an old woman, wrinkled, clumps of gray hair missing. Her skin looked like leather as her eyes leaked onto her cheeks, carrying dirt and streaks onto her chin. Help! Help! Tick, tick, tick. She pushed her feet as hard as she could to carry it to the door. It opened. How? She heard Sam lock it. She looked down at the lock. It had been rusted away. Sam had just been going through the motions, or what she thought was Sam. She peered into the hallway, afraid Sam would show up again, but there was no sign of him. She ventured into the hall and started toward the end with the locked door. It was slightly open. She put her eye to the slit. Doctors lined an operating table on both sides. A machine hovered above, close to the bed. Julia blinked and found herself looking up at the lab coats and the machine from the hospital bed. The humming, the low-pitched reverberation, it was all there. The needle poking toward her eye was spinning as if it were a drill without augers. A smooth drill, light glinting from it. Tick, tick, tick. The people wearing the lab clothes were blurry, but she could feel them smiling, or rather grinning. Yes, Matthews, a breakthrough. Just like last time, a mask covered her mouth and nose and Julia drifted off. Julia wakes up in her bed. Her head is pounding. Tick, tick, tick. The clock was back. Her room was back. She looks at her skin as her hands raised to grip her temples. Normal. Not that being back in this room was any comfort, but she was her younger self again. Julia holds back the tears as she sees the tiny red light of the camera ignite into what seems like a tiny red flame, alerting her that she's being watched. She shot a sinister glare to the camera as she slowly slides herself to the edge of the bed, staring at the camera with her eyes squinting beneath her brow, not moving, just glaring. Tick, tick, tick. Her door opens slowly, the intruder being sure to let the sound of the shrieking metal pierce Julia's remaining fragile sanity. Dr. Matthews kneels in front of her. How are you today, Julia? Julia's head turns slowly to meet his gaze, looking deep into his black soul, her eyes burning into his pupils. If Doctor ever had a fear in this prison, in this cell, it was within this moment. Tick, tick, tick. The clock still counting backwards. Dr. Matthews mustered the air to speak. That's what I thought. As he stood and exited the room, behind him enters the little man carrying a tray of food. You're on lockdown. You'll spend all your time in here. But he sounded almost empathetic. Empathy was something lacking for about a 10-mile radius of this place. He gently places the tray in Julia's lap. I'm sorry, Julia. She gives him the same glare she gave the holy doctor. She hears him gulp down his emotion as he breaks the gaze, stands up, and closes the door as he enters the hallway. The door locks. Julia looks over the tray of produced clay and sand. The smell turns her stomach. But under the cloth napkin, a metal fork. This wasn't allowed. Tick, tick, tick. Julia covers it with the napkin and scoops up the napkin and the fork, hoping the camera isn't catching her actions. The little red light is off. It blinks on just as she tucks the deadly combo under her leg. She places the tray on the floor and lays back in her bed. Julia is numb to anything, everything. Her heartbeat steadies from a loud thump to a low beat. Not like the side effect of the drug. This was intentional. Julia crosses her arms over her chest and lays as still as she can with the napkin and fork remaining under her leg. She knows exactly what to do. Tick, tick, tick. An hour later, the door unlocks and opens. Nurse Mole stands in the doorway grinning. Time for your meds. Julia looks back up at the ceiling. Did you hear me, you little bitch? It's time for your meds. Julia continues to look up at the ceiling, unmoving, her breathing controlled. As Nurse Mole turns to close the door behind her, Julia reaches under her leg and separates the napkin from the fork and tucks both into her sleeve. Her arms cross over her chest again just as the nurse turns to her. She reaches down to Julia's hair and jerks her up to a sitting position. Julia waits. Tick, tick, tick. The nurse leans down and holds Julia's cheeks, squeezing them. Tick, tick, tick. Julia thrusts her arms forward, one with the napkin, the other with the fork. In a smooth motion, she plunges the fork into the nurse's eye and simultaneously shoves the napkin into her mouth, muffling her cries. Julia grabs the back of the nurse's head and plunges the fork deeper into the bitch's eye socket. From the camera angle, it looks like all is normal. The nurse performing her duty. Julia pulls the fork from her eye and thrusts it into the nurse's neck, striking her jugular. Blood spurts onto Julia's maddening face and chest like rain. The evil nurse mole falls to the floor, grasping her neck to no avail. Julia sees the red light return to the camera and watches it from beneath her brow, emotionless, calm, covered in blood. She looks up at the clock and it's gone. Had it ever really been there? The ticking has stopped. It doesn't take long before Sam bursts through the door. He slips in the blood of the dying nurse. Julia takes her moment and shoves the fork into Sam's eye, then repeatedly stabs it into his neck as he tries to fight her off. She stabs so hard the prongs of the fork bend and the handle breaks, leaving the prongs in his neck. Sam falls to the floor just inside the door. Julia watches as the nurse takes her last breath as the door slams open and Julia is grabbed up by her arms. A sharp pain in her neck, not the slow piercing she had felt the first time. This was fast and deep. Talk. Sam struggles to speak and his breath becomes labored, and Julia drifts out of consciousness. She hears Sam's final words. Help. Help. Then, darkness. Julia! Julia! She hears fingers snapping in her face and feels the wind from them. Her eyes open slowly and come into focus as she makes out the shape of Dr. Matthews sitting at his desk across from her. She's leaned back in an oversized chair, her heartbeat rising. The echoes of the clock tick, tick, tick in her mind. She looks down and she's in normal clothes, not the hospital gown she had just been adorned with. Julia, welcome back. I'm going to bring your parents in now so I can speak to all of you about your condition. I have an option I think will benefit you greatly. Julia's parents enter the room. They take the seats on either side of her and each take one of her hands. Then the doctor begins to tell them how he is troubled with her behavior. I have an option. I tried to tell Julia about it, but she zoned out. I don't think she quite heard me. I believe she has Todd Syndrome, otherwise known as Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. It means she has a hard time distinguishing between reality and fantasy. Her condition is rare. I have only seen one other case of it in my 40 years in this practice. There aren't many case studies on it. He calmly states as he pushes his comb over to the side. I'd like to admit her into a facility that I run for a 30-day trial of a medication I've been working on. He hands the parents a brochure, and Julia protests and quietly wishes that fork were in her hand right now, but is quickly silenced. Her father speaks up. This is something we will have to discuss. It sounds serious, but we only brought her here to figure out why she's having nightmares. Julia grabs her mother's hand and squeezes. Her mother looks into Julia's fearful eyes. Yes, we will discuss it tonight and get back with you. The couple stand, along with Julia, and they exit the room. Dr. Matthews listens as the family leaves the office, then turns on his camera, watching the footage of him putting Julia into a hypnotic state. He smiles a devious grin as he listens to himself plant messages into Julia's brain. He picks up the phone from his desk and dials a number. Hello? Comes a stern voice on the other end. Sam, prepare a room. I got another one. She will be arriving tomorrow. A short pause. I can't wait to meet her. If you've enjoyed this story, give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to help my channel grow. All your contributions really do help me create more twisted stories like this one. I thank you all. Until the next time, stay weird.